Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's UX virtual panel. We'll be discussing the differences and similarities between the terms accessibility, universal design, and inclusive design. My name is Laura Goslin. I am the event manager here at DQ Systems. I'll be helping run today's webinar. A few housekeeping things before I go ahead and dive in and give introductions to our panelists. First of all, if you do need closed captions, you can access those via the stream text link posted in chat. You can also hit the closed caption button in Zoom, and those captions will pop up right as an integration feature of Zoom, which is great. Secondly, we're going to save probably the last 10 to 15 minutes or so of the webinar to focus on your questions. We really want to make sure we save time for any of your personal questions. And lastly, this is being recorded. We'll send out the recording to everyone who's attending or registered after the fact via email. So with that, I just kind of want to give a brief introduction to our panelists. First, we have Wendy Chisholm from Microsoft. Really excited to have Wendy here. She's the principal accessibility architect at Microsoft, but also is a strategist for AI and accessibility. And she's been working on a grant program that's accelerating innovations in AI, especially that are built with and for people with disabilities. So I was really proud to have Wendy here. She co-wrote a book with Matt May, who we're also very lucky to have, on universal design for web applications that was edited around the WCAG guidelines 1.0 and 2.0. Secondly, we have Matt May. Matt May is from Adobe. He's the head of inclusive design at Adobe. He works include inclusive design practices across all of Adobe's user experience training and mentoring. He mentors the Adobe design team, and he's been jet setting all during this planning process across India and Romania and other different countries doing UX workshops. So he's busy out there in the field, and we're really lucky to have him here today. Secondly, we have Glenda Sims, our very own Glenda the Good Witch from DQ. She's our team accessibility lead. She has a wide range and expertise and passion for an open web and focuses on government organization, education institutions, and companies from all sizes, small businesses to enterprise organizations. We're super excited to have our very own Good Witch here today. And then fourth, we have Denis Boudreau. He's our principal web accessibility consultant and training at DQ. He actively participates in the W3C as a member of Education and Outreach Working Group. And he leads the development of a framework to break down accessibility responsibility by roles in the development lifecycle. And then lastly, we have Aparna. Aparna is also a team member at DQ. She is one of our accessibility SMEs here who has a strong passion for UX, and we're really excited to have her. So just kind of to run through things, we're going to start off going through each panelist and having them define their own definitions, their own versions of what accessibility means, what inclusive design means, and what universal design means. And within these definitions, we really want them to kind of focus and cover the history and evolution of these terms and how perhaps they've changed and what that really means. So to start, we're going to go with Denis first. So Denis, I'll have you take it away.
I'm going to show you a couple of slides, but I do want to get started by just sharing some insight on why this came to be. We work on accessibility, obviously. I guess most of you do as well. And recently we had to create training for designers specifically. And as Laura was saying, I'm also working on this idea of breaking down accessibility by roles so that we are very specific as to what we teach the different stakeholders and make sure that it is always relevant to them. So as I was doing that, at some point, I started researching the notions of universal design and inclusive design. And up until that point, they kind of meant the same thing to me. And the more I read about it, the more perplexed I was, because I just couldn't accept the fact that they were actually the same thing. And to me, they needed to be different things. So I started researching that, read a couple of articles here and there, a couple of books, and grew a very strong feeling that they were actually very different things. But when you research on the web, if you Google any of those terms, they intersect quite a bit, and people are using them interchangeably most of the time. So I wanted to sort of define this more clearly and provide the community, all of us, with maybe some insights as to what that was. So we reached out to Wendy, to Matt, and then internally to some of our folks, and we came up with this. So I'm going to give you the perspective that I grew, that I ended up growing over time, and we'll use that as a starting point for everybody else to sort of build their own perspective to it. And if I'm lucky enough, they will actually disagree with me, and we'll have some kind of a debate on the whole thing. So,
hey,
so where
Denis,
I'm gonna,
before
yeah.
you go too far, I think folks need help with the captions aren't working.
Hi, yes, guys,
Okay.
sorry, I'm kind of troubleshooting as we go. I do see
Okay.
that the integrated closed captioning in Zoom is working, but the stream text link, we're just trying to troubleshoot that real quick. Great,
Okay,
thanks, Wendy.
Thanks for letting me know. And I should probably speak a little slower as well. That might help. So yes, so basically the idea, like I said, I came to the conclusion that they were not the same thing, but the perspective that I have on that might be biased by my own values and my own understanding of what the work that we do. So I'm just going to share my screen for a couple of slides here, and then this might, let's see here. So hopefully you can see that. So I'm gonna cover a little bit on universal design first, and then I'm gonna switch to inclusive design and show you where I think there's a difference between the two, and all of that with the utmost respect for the work that Wendy and Matt did. I read that book probably 5 times over in the last 10, 12 years. Constantly went back to it. But what I realized at some point is that the web has changed, our job has changed, the work has changed since then, and maybe it's time to rethink or revisit those terms. So to me, the idea of the universal design comes from this mentality that it's a one-size-fits-all approach. We are trying to build this one website that is meant to work for everyone. So this idea of universality comes from the fact that you are building this one site, you're using the WCAG guidelines, and hopefully you create a site that actually works for everyone. Now, any of us who have worked with this for a while understand that the WCAG requirements are actually, the bar is actually pretty low, and you could implement a particular checkpoint or success criteria so that it works or it meets the requirement, but still it would not work for some people. I'll give you some examples of that a little later on. But I've grown to think that the idea of creating this one website that actually works for everyone is more of a utopia than anything else. So it is limited in a way. You can create a site that is fully compliant, but it still will not work for some people in some context. So I'm going to leave it at that for now on the universal design front, and just move to the inclusive design aspect of things, where instead of thinking of it as a one-size-fits-all mentality, I'm looking at it from a one-size-fits-one mentality. And this idea of one-size-fits-all, one-size-fits-one comes from Kat Holmes, who's been very much involved in pushing inclusive design further and way beyond the web, but I'm consciously keeping it to the web for now. But in this case, what you're doing is basically going beyond what WCAG offers. So recognizing the utopia of universal design for what it is, trying to be provocative there, and then just aiming to account for a very wide range, a very diverse range of needs, expectations from users, and that you can only address or take account for if you are involving those users in your process. So instead of just saying, here's WCAG, we would still work with WCAG in most cases, but we would make sure that we go much further than that by involving as many users as possible with different needs, different expectations, and then adjust what we have so that we can accommodate their needs on top of what we are offering to begin with. So if the biggest flaw from universal design was the idea that the site actually won't work for everyone in every single situation, the flaw when it comes to inclusive design could be resumed, I guess, or summarized by get woke, get broke. If you agree to this and you start working way beyond what WCAG requires, it's actually going to cost you a lot more in terms of effort and money and everything else. And in the past, we've talked plenty about how compliance and accessibility weren't the same thing. Hopefully, we're still agreeing on these things. Our research, our experience internally shows that 60–70% of the issues that we find when we assess websites actually could have been addressed at the design phase if only designers knew about these things. And again, it's beyond the idea of simply following WCAG, but really accounting for different needs that are well beyond what WCAG covers. Whether we're talking about what is actually being covered in level 2, AA or level AAA, for instance. As we know, level AAA, you have more of a likelihood to integrate aspects that will help someone who's dyslexic, for instance, someone who's on the autism spectrum, someone who has low vision. Like those things did not make it to level A or AA. So we are consciously pushing further that way. But also the idea of anything that is currently not covered by WCAG or could not be covered because you can't really frame it the way that you need to for it to be recognized as a requirement. Those things just aren't part of the equation. But yet people actually need those considerations in order to be able to use these sites as well. So a couple of examples, like I said, of those things. Think about alt text, for instance. See, if we decide to go with recent technologies, we might decide to use the ARIA label attribute instead of the alt attribute, which would work perfectly fine for most people, which would be completely compliant when it comes to WCAG. But if you have someone using an older technology that doesn't support ARIA, for instance, that person would not get that alt text. Or if you're thinking not so recent, the design patterns that aren't that recent these days, but think about like endless or infinite scrolling, for instance. You think of any website where they're showcasing a bunch of pictures, and then, for instance, each of the pictures has 3 or 4 different elements to it, maybe like the author of the picture itself, how many likes that picture had, the comments about that picture, and you try to make that keyboard accessible. You could easily create an accessible website that conforms to 2.1.1 for keyboard access, but you would still create an experience that would be a nightmare for someone who struggles with using the keyboard, say because of arthritis or because it's just hard to do that in the first place. If every image requires 5 or 6 tab stops to go through every single aspect of that image, and you have 500 images in your page, before you load another 500, and you can do that for thousands of images, there's no way for you to be able to use this in a way that works. So again, thinking about universal design where we're applying concepts for keyboard access could work really well, theoretically, but could still break for some people. And then we have a bunch of other examples like that. Think cognitive overload. If you have an interface that is really, really crowded, someone who struggles with ADHD, for instance, there really isn't much in WCAG that will help you sort of minimize these challenges. Think about a site that would be very heavy on metaphors, for instance. Someone who struggles with the spoken language, someone who's not a native speaker, for instance, might completely miss what that means. Someone who's on the autism spectrum might not understand what we're talking about. Again, WCAG doesn't do much for that. Or think text-heavy interfaces. So thinking dyslexia, again, there isn't that much that will help you in WCAG, especially at level A or AA, a little bit more at level AAA. But again, WCAG will not be sufficient to really help those users. In all of those cases and dozens of other cases, what you really need to be thinking about is working with how these different users are presenting the information so that, or interact with the information so that they can actually use it and be successful as well. So a little bit of a diagram here where I'm looking at, so what we're seeing on the screen basically is like a bar chart, 4 different bars. The first one on the left corner is not that high, so it's the lowest of the 4. And it sort of represents WCAG 2.x level AA. There's another one next to it is a little higher, goes a little higher, so goes to AAA. Those I like to think would represent the idea of universal design, where we're trying to do as much as we can within the boundaries of requirements. But the third bar goes higher than the first 2. That one is, say, for instance, usability testing involving people with disabilities. So this idea of just involving them, but still within the parameters of universal design, but then pushing that way further by involving all these users specifically to address very particular needs or expectations that we've identified, or others that we let the users identify for us because we can't claim to know all of these challenges in the first place. And that piece is where I think we can really talk about inclusive design. And I think that's where I like to draw the line to create a distinction between what is universal versus what is inclusive design. And when we think about inclusive design, basically, I like to think about this idea of designing for the extremes, which is not a new concept either. But when we are designing for those extreme cases, say people that have disabilities, people that have severe anxiety, for instance, we will be designing our interfaces, the interactions, very differently. We will take advantage, or we'll pay attention rather to those needs first, knowing that people that are in the middle of that bell curve, the average users, people that are using mobile devices, people that are getting older, they will just naturally benefit from these considerations, just because by designing for those extreme cases, we are also accounting for the needs of those who actually don't struggle with the challenges we're trying to address. So that's kind of my high-level take on it. And very quickly to wrap this up, just use the little analogy with keyboard, hotel key cards. So, which is something that I use in training as well. So you have a first key card. So if you're not familiar with hotel key cards, you use those to open your door to your room. So very first one, very typical one, is a card that has a little arrow pointing forward. So you know how to actually insert it in this slot. And then there's a magnetic strip on the other side. A card like this works okay if you know how to use it, if you can see that little arrow. There's nothing that stands out. So if you're blind, you can't really know which side you need to use it unless you try a bunch of different ways. So to me, but this really is still a card that complies with industry standards. That card is still okay. It works. It's universally accessible in that sense. But you can go a little further. You could use the same kind of card with a magnetic strip and a little arrow pointing in the direction, but you have a corner that's cut. So if you can place your finger and know that the bottom left corner is going to be the one that's cut. Therefore, that's how you insert it. And someone who's blind could theoretically have a better chance of using this one. And both to me are universal design. They're both conforming to standards, they're conforming to requirements, but they're still going to have issues. They're still going to create issues for you. As opposed to this one here, which basically has nothing on it, because it doesn't really matter. We don't really care which way you insert it, because the idea is that you're going to take that card and tap it next to your door, and the door will open for you regardless of the side or the orientation that you use it. And that to me is, again, where I draw the line between universal design and inclusive design. So with that said, I've spoken already quite a bit. So I'm going to stop there and stop sharing my screen.
Great, thanks, Denis. Okay, so now we're going to move down the line, and Aparna, I just want to see and hear from you to see what you have to add on to what Denis was saying in terms of your own definition.
Yes, thank you so much. Before I start, apologies if I'm sounding low. I've just returned from US. I'm still jet lagged, and so apologies if I'm sounding low or not so motivated.
Sound great.
Thank you. So, I really agree with what Denis just said about one size fits all or average user being a myth, and accepting or understanding that is the first step towards a better world. Right. So for me, accessibility is never a project. It is a process that goes on, because you cannot say that I've started the accessibility project. Many times I get this question from the clients, that, yeah, we have started this accessibility project. So will we be done in 6 weeks? Are we done in 6 months? That is never the case, because yes, post development, we do the assessment, we give you the issues, but that is not going to resolve the problem of being accessible, right? So when you plan or when you design your next product, you will still end up in that same bucket because you're not thinking about accessibility right from the beginning. So I always say, don't see it as a project, but think it as a process. And you don't, discontinue doing it. You embrace accessibility like a lifelong process. And where we were at the Momentum last week, one of our DQ events, and a very good friend of mine, as you know, they were saying that you'll be done with digital accessibility only when you're done creating or changing the digital content, which really means that creating or changing or updating digital content and accessibility goes hand in hand. Right? So with this thought, I believe accessibility can be a new form of design itself. Because when I think about universal design, it was basically designed for the physical world. Those 7 principles that universal design really talks about is about the physical world or the infrastructural kind of thing. But we've customized it, we have modified it to suit our needs for the digital world. Does that mean that, because universal design really says about one design fits all, but we just heard Denis speak about it, that it might not be the case, correct? So we need to accept that that is not the case. And then from that point, if we see inclusive design, for me, inclusive design is performing an action in different ways, right? For example, if we take a submit button, a user can click using a mouse, move focus using a keyboard, can touch or using a mouse stick, be able to activate it, or even with the eye tracker, eye gazing, the system can be able to take the input, or with a speech input software, I should be able to submit it. So these are all the different ways of interacting with that particular element. And if we don't keep these different ways of interaction, then we are missing out on those extreme cases. We are not considering all the users that might be interacting with our system. So really, for me, inclusive design is a design which includes people in the design process, where they are the center, and an action or a verb can be thought in different multiple ways of addressing it. And even with that, I feel there might be some gaps, right? We may not be completely inclusive. So accessible design can be a totally new form that might have all the good things and much more in it, and giving that complete user experience to any person should be the utmost importance. So it ideally, in the ideal world, equality of use should be the principle or focus of the principles. But unfortunately, WCAG looks at the minimal compliance, right? If I'm saying I'm WCAG compliant, it doesn't mean that I am giving a great user experience to my users, but you are able to interact with my product. But as a designers or product owners or developers, what we really need to aim is to get that 100% satisfaction from the users, because if that is achieved, then I believe they will be our lifelong customers, right? They would want, the first thing, if they think about a product, it should be us. So that kind of user experience can come when we think about all the extreme cases, not leaving even 1% of the person behind. So in these, equal use or equality of use brings in the example of date picker, because that is something that I really see a lot of times commonly. Now, the minimal compliance can be a text field where you can enter. So I'm not violating WCAG, I'm still meeting it. But am I giving an equal experience to all users? Because I can visually see, I can relate the dates, month, I can see a lot of other things, but as a sighted or non-sighted user, I may not be able to see that. As a keyboard-only operable user, I may not be able to interact with it, right? So it is giving me more information, and I'm not giving that information to all users. That is definitely not being inclusive. Another recent example that I really went through was the kiosk, the immigration kiosk. When I was waiting in queue for immigration in the US, I saw these automation machines doing all the manual work for us. But when I really saw people, they were using wheelchairs, and someone else had to come and assist them because their passport wasn't being scanned. The height wasn't being adjusted. Only when the picture of the person was to be taken, the height of the kiosk was being adjusted, right? And if I'm a non-sighted user, I do not have access to any of those announcements. So I basically need to let go of my privacy and ask someone to help me out, to give my documents to them and help me out through this immigration process. Are we being inclusive here? Not really. So when we think about all these use cases, all these users, I believe we will be in a better world, because I'm not saying usability and accessibility go hand in hand, but they together can make this world a really better place. So with that, I rest my case, and I really believe in a better digital world. Thank you.
Thanks, Aparna. Those were some really, really well-defined definitions that I think build on a lot of what Denis was talking about, which is really, really great. And I liked your different examples. I kind of want to turn it over to Glenda, because I feel like she's itching. I can see her sitting there just waiting to dive in. So Glenda, I'm going to turn it over to you.
I am. We've already heard great things from Denis and Aparna, and I want to make time for Wendy and Matt, so I'm going to try and keep this brief. So for me, accessibility isn't accessibility without the result. And I go back to the definition that I learned from my accessibility mom, Sharon Rush: when all people, regardless of disabilities, can use the same information and functionality. That's what accessibility is, whether it's digital or whether it's physical. When it comes to inclusive design, in contrast, inclusive design is a verb. It's a process. And inclusive design does not just relate to accessibility. Within our field of digital accessibility, inclusive design would mean designing with people with disabilities, not just for them. And when we say designing with people with disabilities, I'm not just talking about calling them in and asking their opinion, or running a usability test, or having them test at the end. I'm actually talking about getting involved in the definition of what needs to be done, and the research, and the prototyping, and the testing. So one of my great examples of inclusive design in the field of accessibility is actually happening at the W3C with the accessibility guidelines. People with disabilities are actually involved in the creation of those guidelines. And thinking about inclusive design outside the digital space, there's a known problem when we look in the field of medicine, where much of the research that's been done, it's been done by men. And so there's actually a gender bias in our medical research in the world. And so the principles of inclusive design apply way beyond the digital or the accessibility field. And for universal design, I understand where that term came from. It really is an older term. It came from the built environment, the physical environment, things I can knock on. And it's designing a product that can be used by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. For me, and you guys correct me if you think I'm wrong, but universal design as applied to the web is such a narrow concept, because we can have adaptation and the tuning of digital much easier than we can a physical object. Taking this to a universal design perspective, just an example on the web, I recently saw a great article about the Lyft color system. So I don't know whether you're an Uber person or you're a Lyft person, but look up the Lyft, L-Y-F-T color system, and what you're going to see is this organization has chosen to meet the W3C requirements for color contrast. So they did something to make it usable by people with low vision or color blindness. In addition, from a universal design perspective, that helps every single one of us trying to read that Lyft system outside on our mobile phones in bright sunlight. So one thing that helps multiple people. So those are my points that I wanted to add. Laura, back to you.
So now we're going to transition a bit to Wendy. And I think Wendy has some great examples that kind of go beyond the web and beyond compliance. And I think that it's a great venue and a great direction to go in. So I'm going to pass it to you, Wendy.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to vehemently defend universal design. No, I'm not. Basically, I agree with what they're saying, and I think if you look at the context that we were in when we wrote the book, and Matt can talk more about this, it was a very different world. It was a very different time, and we were building on the progress that the built environment made in making sure that things were more accessible. The ADA, universal design, laid the groundwork literally for us to build on in the digital world. At the time, I mean, we were fighting against text-only sites, and we were trying to help people expand what they could do with a website. And we were reaching out to our allies in internationalization and mobile, because some of the first websites that appeared on phones that were working well were also accessible. So at that time, it helped us reach a broader audience. And that's really what was so important 10 years ago. It's been 10 years. So now here we are. And I think what's most exciting about inclusive design is that it isn't just about accessibility. It isn't just about disability. And matter of fact, to Glenda's point, this is the first time where we really start to see nothing about us without us. Because the most important piece of this is not just building for, but building with and by. And that's really where we get exciting things happening, like seeing AI, right? That's an application that was created by an engineer who was blind. And from that, many other beautiful things have happened. So I'm spending a lot of my time right now in AI. And unfortunately, seeing the same patterns over and over again. I've been doing this for 25 years. When we first looked at Java, it didn't have accessibility built in. It took 6 months from the introduction of the alt attribute or the image element to have the alt attribute. And now here we are again in AI. And you're seeing that same kind of bias and this lack of access because people aren't being included from the very beginning. The ideas aren't always being inclusive. And so this is where inclusive design, if it can apply to AI, when it applies to AI, I think we have an amazing opportunity to get this next wave of technology accessible earlier. But it's a much more difficult problem for us in getting that data, right? It's all based on data. It's much easier to take a picture of a plant or an animal than a person. We have privacy issues, we have security issues. So getting the data that we need to build inclusive AI is kind of the problem that we're tackling right now. And the best way to do that is to hire engineers with a variety of characteristics. And that's what's so exciting about inclusive design, is because you're looking at the intersectionality of humans. We all have so many different characteristics, from gender, background, culture, ethnicity, language, skin color, everything. And so we need all those aspects in our systems. And so this is why I think inclusive design is exciting for the future, and why universal design was so important for our past. Done.
Awesome. Mic drop. All right. All right. Last but not least, I really want to turn it over to you, Matt. I want to see, maybe we could talk about the kind of history and evolution of the terms
Sure.
as well, because I know you and Wendy wrote that book together. So maybe if you could touch on that, that would be great.
Yeah, and so I actually am going to really genuinely defend universal design as a concept, because the one thing that I found is that there's a terminological issue. People get locked up on that term universal, and they throw out the baby with the bathwater in that they ignore the rest of what was being said there. So I took some notes and have some actual definitions of this. So British Standards Institute defined inclusive design based on basically the terminology of universal design. And there's one part of this that everybody needs to know, which is the definition is the design of mainstream products and or services that are accessible to and usable by as many people as reasonably possible without the need for special adaptation or specialized design, right? That's valuable information that even Ron Mace, the creator of the term universal design, was talking about trying to take things that will work for the greatest number of people and build it into concrete, right? Like the idea of like the difference between sort of design and implementation is important. The idea of expressing these ideas before we start actually shoveling, we start building these structures matters, because those structures are what hold. Right? When even if we think about a website as kind of building a house, as an example, or an app, the construction of that means that you are fixed in a certain place. And accessibility, to me, historically, has been basically sort of eliding, skipping over the entire design process and only focusing on when you're pouring the concrete. And so what ends up happening is, because it hasn't been thought of up until that point, we don't ever actually make meaningful progress toward that one goal. And I think one of the biggest cases of this being a problem here and now is design systems, right? The idea with universal design is that what he was talking about, what Ron Mace was talking about, advocates of that in that era, is now just called building code, right? That's what the height of a fixture on the wall, of like a switch, a door, the width of a door, how much space to get around. That's what he was advocating for wheelchair users like himself to get in and navigate within a space. That's what a design system is. Like, we are saying, this is the way, these are the things that we build into all of the components from which we build the rest of the application. And this is where inclusive design comes in, because now we think about this from the beginning. And to connect with, I think everyone kind of reached this at a certain point, that the designer, this idea of like design thinking, is to say, Cynthia Bennett wrote this article, wrote this academic paper about this, where she says that to talk about design thinking, or is to say that basically, I am the designer and you are the user, and that basically just locks in the idea that disabled people can't be the designer. So that equity in the system is something that needs to be addressed. So inclusive design doesn't exist unless you're actively engaging and valuing and giving equity to the people that you're designing for, right? That, so, and that for and with, people can design for themselves, but everybody has the opportunity to be a designer, to be, to be listened to in that. And that kind of brings us into the definition of the Inclusive Design Research Center, which is the one that we use at Adobe, which is design that considers the full range of human diversity with respect to ability, language, culture, gender, age, and other forms of human difference. So we're not just talking about disability, because disability doesn't exist in a vacuum. If we start talking about things like age, then obviously disability comes into the picture later in life. And so we have to think about not just people as this monoliths of, like, you have this property and this property and this property, therefore we will design for those three things. Your life changes over years, over days, over moments. The idea of approaching this from an inclusive lens is to be aware that there is no average user, there is no normal user. There's just the people that we've already designed for. I think the next step is just to sort of break people out of that mindset into realizing that things need to be adaptable over all of those spheres.
Awesome, thanks, Matt. Really great points. I saw a lot of head noddings. I mean, I had to snap at one point just because there's some good moving things that you said there, which I appreciate. So thank you for that. Now we've talked about our definitions, but I really want our audience to kind of, they have these solid definitions. They know where to go. I think we're all kind of on the same page here, but I really want to touch on what this actually means in, people's day-to-day jobs. What does it mean as a community as we're moving forward? So at this point, I'm going to let it be a free-for-all. Panelists, if anyone has anything they want to chime in on either of those two questions, go for it.
So go over the questions again. I'm not sure that I got what.
Well, one is, where are we going as a community? And two, what does it mean in people's everyday jobs and in applications? Like, why are these terms so important, and why is it important to have these solid definitions as people are designing?
I can try to get us started.
Yeah.
So I think from a community perspective, words matter. Like, words are important. We have to agree on definitions, otherwise we're just not getting anywhere. So I think, and I don't know just how successful we are going to be with this one webinar here, but trying to define more clearly what each term means. And we basically had very similar but yet quite different definitions of this. It's an interesting starting point to try and define that. But as a community, I think that we need to become more mindful of what those things mean, what the approach, like what is the implicit approach that comes with either one of those terms, so that we are basically speaking the same language ultimately. And I think that is like one of the things that I liked from what Wendy said was this idea that, and maybe that's not the one definition that we agree on eventually, but this idea that universal design is looking at things from the perspective of the past versus the future. I kind of like that. But at the same time, what I was bringing with compliance versus going beyond compliance in the context of the web itself, like voluntarily keeping it to the digital space works too. But what I wish that comes out of this basically, and I'm going to leave it at that, is that as we keep writing articles, as we keep talking about these things, as we keep producing content to try and advance that cause that we're defending, that we're being clearer on the terms that we use, whether it's universal design or inclusive design, or whether it's anything else that we talk about in this space, that we come to an agreement on the terms so that we are reducing the confusion that comes with trying to understand what it is that we're talking about in the work that we do.
Yeah, I think the more allies that we're pulling together, the more powerful we're going to be in changing the world. I mean, like I said, in AI, we don't have compliance right now. There's no WCAG, right? There's some really great principles out there that people are talking about, but there's no agreement on it yet. And to me, if inclusive design as a process is what people are using, then the outcomes should be more accessible, equitable, all these things that we're talking about. So I think it's absolutely paramount that these principles, this process, are taught and everybody gets them. Otherwise, we're going to end up, 6-10 years from now, and we're going to be in the same place we were with WCAG way back when, and it's going to take us another decade to catch up. I don't want to do that again, so that's why I think it's critical. And I agree, if we have that same language, that helps us all rally around a single point and coalesce our allies from this intersectionality that's so important right now.
I would say that one reason for us to focus on terminology, especially around inclusive design, is that there are so many different people that are using that term, that you need to have some kind of agreement as to what that means, because it just doesn't seem, it seems superfluous. Like it seems like a good idea, but with no practical aspects to it. And we're actually working on training materials that have practical exercises around that specific, like around how do we do this in the design space. We don't, like, my training for our designers does not talk about the laws. It doesn't talk about WCAG. It talks about the needs of users and how to ask good questions and how to integrate that feedback into how we build our products. There's been tons of effort on the engineering side to do that. So WCAG has code level examples for that, but designers don't think that way. And that's where most of our problems have come. So so we have a head of inclusive design, so me on the design side, and we have Andrew Kirkpatrick, who's the head of accessibility. And I like to think that basically we're sort of harbor masters on two sides of the sea, right? I am pointing people, I'm pointing people in the right direction that they will end up in the accessible harbor. His job is to sort of bring them into that space. But I think there is a continuum across that process where inclusion has to be outlined all the way through.
So also, I believe it is important to identify that when we talk about inclusive design, yes, an agreement on a unique definition, and not just focusing on persons with disabilities. It's about users, right? It's about any user, because whenever I talk to designers, all I hear is color contrast. That's one thing they always ask, and nothing more than that, right? There's no other user for them. It's only if I choose the proper colors, I'm accessible. But when we're talking about inclusivity, that is not what the first thing that should come. People with disabilities are not the only group of users. They are one of the many. So having that mindset will also help us move in the right direction.
So just one data point on that. Google Assistant was found to be 70% more likely for a man's voice than a woman's voice to be understood. But that's not just gender. That's also that's also dialect. So we have a geographic or national component to it. It also affects people who are nonverbal, people who might have a tic or a stutter. So all of those things are parts of the problem. If we just say it's about disability, then we make a text interface and we say, and we're done. There's a much bigger problem set to that.
Can I go back to one thing you said, Matt? And I think you did that on purpose. So you were talking about designing for the needs of users while talking about making things more inclusive. Did you on purpose not say users with disabilities? Because I think that would be the point, is get to a stage, so to speak, where it's no longer about designing for people with disabilities versus designing for other people. It's just for designing for people.
Yes.
Accounting for all the different needs that they may have. And that includes people with disabilities, and includes people like me or Aparna who have English as a second language. It includes anyone who just doesn't fit the mold of that average user, basically.
Yes.
Sure. And I think like right now it's what we're doing is more of an intervention because disabled users have not been adequately represented in the research that's gone into it. So we're working with our design research organization on affirmatively bringing people in who had been marginalized, and everything from the recruitment to the day of event work that needs to happen to integrating that feedback. But in that, the issue that we really have to deal with is to get to the point that everybody is actually listened to. And over time, we know a lot about accessibility because we've researched a lot about that. We don't know a lot about a whole bunch of other things other ways in which people are excluded. So we can't just stop by saying, oh, we all pass WCAG every time we do it, so good job, I guess we're done. There's so much more that we can be doing.
And I think that those of us on this panel, how many of us have been in this field for more than 15 years or 20 years, okay? And so it's easy for us to say a sentence like designing for all users, and we have that broad variety of users in mind, and we think about the extremes, and we know how designing for average is actually a failure point. Kat Holmes's favorite example of the fighter jet that was literally causing accidents because it was designed for the average jet fighter pilot and worked not well for a single one that they measured for real. And so I think there's a danger in not including the different categories of disabilities and the spectrums and the temporary disabilities, because yes, we think of it, but there are people that aren't regularly exposed to it.
Great. So we have 8 minutes left. So I really want to make sure that we get a couple of attendee questions in before we wrap things up. So thank you, everybody, for everything so far. I wrote down one question which came in that I thought was quite good, which is where does, and I think we've touched on it, but just to kind of hone back in, but where does user-centered design fit into this picture?
Who wants to take that one?
I mean, I think there's a component of that term that that rubs me the wrong way, because it does reinforce that, like, I'm the designer and you're the person and never the twain shall meet. We have yeah, it's a good idea in, like, sort of at the atomic level to seek that feedback, and I think that's kind of the default. I think everybody should understand that as the norm for design. But I think also it kind of has a terminological issue because it just means I focus on the people that I'm already focused on. So we can already start to see the boundaries being drawn based on your own kinds of biases about who it is that you're supposed to be designing for.
Great. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, you've already kind of defined the user in your mindset.
Awesome. So another quick question here is the W3C and has produced WCAG as an attempt to kind of cover universal design, but is there somewhere that people can turn for more of a framework around inclusive design? Any key pieces of resources that you think you should point people to that you've enjoyed?
I mean, there's the Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit, which has some interesting exercises and stuff in it that the Microsoft design team created. And then I think everyone's waiting for the training and the deliverables that Matt's creating to be made public.
Yeah, I'm working on it. So I've done 7 of them internally. So everybody in Adobe Design is getting this full day inclusive design training, including kind of practical aspects of including things like labels, reading order, tab order, regions, alt text into into design deliverables. So that's a project that we're working on with Adobe XD called Blue Line. I'm going to be finished doing this worldwide tour. I just got back on Saturday from India. We did New York, Hamburg, Bucharest, Bangalore, and Delhi in one trip. So when I'm done in January, we're going to wrap that up, put a little bow on it, and make that publicly available. So early next year, you'll be able to see the materials of that workshop. And then we're just moving on to the next, to the next ideas, like the design research stuff. Same thing. We're going to be open and transparent about that. And content strategy is another thing that we need to be thinking about.
Great, thanks. Another question here. Wendy, you mentioned bias in AI, and you've talked about how that relates to inclusive design. Do you have any other examples or maybe techniques that you could touch on as it relates to AI or even AR and VR? Anything that's, a mixed medium.
Yeah. As I said, I think that we're still trying to figure it out. This is not a problem that we've solved. I know one thing that we're doing is we're giving grants just to help get more people working on this, and specifically looking to fund entrepreneurs with disabilities, because we really want to literally put our money where our mouth is in terms of making sure that these new innovations are designed with or by people with disabilities. But I think one of the interesting examples is speech recognition, which came up. And, there are many ways that right now speech recognition is showing its bias. As Denis alluded to, in terms of accents, we're spending a lot of time right now looking at, in terms of people with non-typical speech, whether you have ALS or cerebral palsy or other ways that your mouth may form words differently. And so collecting that data, it's an intensive process, but how can we crowdsource more of that data? There are some really exciting projects like from Mozilla, who is collecting a large open data set. And so we're really looking to do more of that. I think you've seen that with image recognition. Jeff Bigham and the folks at University of Texas have done some good image challenges to get images of like photos that were taken by people who are blind, so that we can help people give more feedback in terms of, if you're out there using your app to read a street sign, well, we need more images of street signs that are taken by people who are blind, because it's going to be off center and blurry. And, a lot of the data right now is not realistic. And so I think that's a big challenge we have, is how do we get that data that is literally from more perspectives, so that we're training the systems to not continue the bias that's right there right now. And so I don't think we've solved it. I think we know where we want to invest and we know what needs to be done, but it's not super obvious right now how to do that.
If I can add to that real quick. Historically, we talked about how visual impairments, mobility impairments, hearing impairments, and cognitive impairments were the four main categories that we were thinking about for accessibility. Voice UIs being the next big thing. We never talked about speech impairments before, but it most likely will become the biggest challenge that we'll face in these next upcoming years, because there's nothing planned so far to help for that, except some kind of a fallback to a form instead of actually voicing what you're asking for. Matt was talking about how men are more likely to be understood by Google Assistant, for instance, as long as you're not French speaking in the first place, because I fight with mine all the time. And it took a huge amount of time for it to train and recognize how I was saying words. And yeah, so there's definitely a gap there that we are just starting to identify and notice.
Yeah, we're already behind. I mean, that's like I said, I feel like I'm in 1995 again. So I hate playing catch up.
All right, so unfortunately we've come to the end of our time. That went really fast. If we didn't get to your questions, I will share those with the panelists, and we can figure out a way to kind of distribute those up and get your questions answered. Of course, this is being recorded. We'll send it out to everybody via email if you'd like to view that after the fact.
Thanks for joining, y'all. Bye.
Bye.